So today we are going to learn about whale snot, apparently. So believe it or not, scientists like our guest, Dr. Richard, can learn a lot from the exhale of dolphins, whales, and his focus is going to be on beluga whales. And so he will share with us how this is collected, why it is useful, and I think you are in Rhode Island at the moment?
Yep, that's
Is
correct.
that right?
Yep.
So he is a professor at the University of Rhode Island, and we know Justin for many years. Kathleen can backstory that, but Dr. Richard also leads courses to our Roatan, Honduras field site. So that is where our connection comes from. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Justin.
Thank you.
Our other Justin, our DCP followers are used to Justin Gregg with the DCP connection. So we welcome you today, Dr. Richard.
Thank you very much. Sure. Well, thank you, Kel and Kathleen, for inviting me today. I'm always excited when I have a chance to talk to a captive audience about whale snot because it's fun stuff. So I'm going to pull up my slides here so we can have fun pictures to look at while I'm yapping at you. All right. So
Justin,
yeah, we're going to...
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to turn my video off, but I'll turn my video on to ask questions if they come through.
Please do, and I encourage everyone to ask questions. I'd rather pretend like I'm talking to humans and not little black squares. So please feel free to send those questions to the chat to Kathleen.
Thank you.
But yeah, we're going to learn about whale snot today. And my research focuses on these particular animals. These are beluga whales. So for those of you who might not be familiar with beluga whales, this is what they look like. Belugas are a very charismatic species. They're very well known for their white coloration, of course. And you can see them at aquariums throughout the country. And my work focuses on the beluga whales that live at Mystic Aquarium in Mystic, Connecticut. And my background is I was a beluga whale trainer for nearly 10 years. That's me in my younger days brushing a whale's teeth in the top left. And I transitioned into a researcher. So now I'm at the University of Rhode Island studying beluga whales, using a lot of the ideas and concepts and ability to train these animals that I developed as a trainer to now learn things about these animals that we wouldn't otherwise be able to learn. And so that's what I want to focus on today. And the research program at Mystic Aquarium is very robust and has many different facets to it. And these are just some picture examples of research projects that I was involved with as a trainer that really helped to inspire me to become a scientist myself. And part of this was being able to collaborate with Kathleen during this time when I was mentoring interns in these research projects. And so this very kind of instrumental in my path in becoming a scientist, but I was able to train beluga whales to wear critter cams. I trained beluga whales to lie still for ultrasound exams so that we can monitor reproductive events and internal organs. This beluga has been trained to wear blindfolds so that we can train this whale to perform tasks using echolocation, which is a fun story for another day. This whale is sitting in a chamber that would collect all of the CO2 that she produces in order to calculate her metabolic rate so that we can get an understanding of how much energy a beluga whale needs on a day-to-day basis so that they can predict if there's enough food in the habitat for wild beluga whales. So it's really inspiring to be involved in research that all had such important implications on the conservation and management of belugas in the wild. And belugas are somewhat unique in that they're one of only 3 species of whales or dolphins that live in the Arctic year-round. So this map is showing a view of the Arctic. So we're looking down onto the top of the globe, and you can see that beluga habitat here in the yellow is found off the coasts of Greenland and Canada, Alaska, Russia, and this little bit of Norway up here. And they are supremely adapted for life in the Arctic. In fact, you might see them in a habitat like this. This is a breathing hole in the ice that's been closed off from other breathing holes, and they may have to survive for many days in a situation like this. And they are supremely adapted for this kind of harsh lifestyle that you'll find in the Arctic. Now, the Arctic, as we know, is changing rapidly with climate change impacting sea ice. Sea ice is a really important feature for beluga whale habitat. Their migration patterns center around sea ice formation and breaking up. And also they do a lot of feeding along the sea ice edge, which is a very productive area where there can be a lot of upwelling. And so it's easier to find fish in that area. And so it's an important feature of the beluga whale's habitat. And we know that it's changing rapidly. So this is the minimum sea ice extent in the Arctic in 1983. So this would be typical summer sea ice coverage. And this is the minimum sea ice extent in the summer of 2012. And so this is impacting, if you remember from that map with the yellow, this is impacting beluga habitat. This is changing. And we're just starting to learn how these changes are going to affect beluga whales and whether or not they're going to be able to adapt to these dramatic changes to their environment. And just to kind of bring this more to the current day, so this is the minimum.
Justin?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. In the previous slide, you had a circle, and in the 1983 slide, you had a circle, and the circle changed in size. Did that have any indication? Was that related to the sea ice and the amount or the depth, or?
I think that is, you know what, I don't know.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just looked at it and thought, you know, it got so much smaller in the 2012 versus the 1983 image. I thought maybe it was related to something related to their habitat. So sorry, I just was curious.
No, good question. I have no idea what that little circle is. You can find these images of Arctic sea ice extent. NASA posts their satellite images. It's really cool. And so that's, you know, where we're getting some of these images. So this is from September 1st. So this is a very recent one. And this is showing where the ice extent is based on satellite imagery. And then the orange line shows the median ice edge from the 80s till 2010, meaning that half of the time there's less ice than this and half of the time there's more ice than this. And you can see how much less than that median we're seeing now. So again, this is having a dramatic impact on beluga whale habitat. Now there's one beluga whale population that I'm most interested in because it is the only population of beluga whales in the United States that's considered endangered currently. And this is in the Cook Inlet in Alaska. And in this population, you have belugas that are reproductively and geographically isolated from all the other beluga whale populations throughout the Arctic. And there's only 279 of them in this population, which is much lower than historical population sizes. Now, one of the big questions for this population is they've been endangered since 2008, which means that they've been receiving an awful lot of protections in form of designation of critical habitat and ensuring that there's not a lot of anthropogenic or human-caused impacts in their environment. But it's not clear why they're not growing. They should be growing with all of these protective measures around this population. This population should be increasing in size, and it's not. And so this is a big question as to why this population is not growing at the rate that it should be, and trying to understand what factors might be limiting the recovery of this unique population of belugas. And of course, if we're going to understand how populations grow, we need to understand reproduction and where and how these animals are able to reproduce and raise their young. That's how populations get bigger. We need babies. We know a fair amount of beluga reproduction because of studies in zoos and aquariums. So for example, we know that they are seasonal breeders that breed in the late winter and early spring. And then they have a 15-month gestation period so that they'll give birth the following summer. when food is most abundant for them. So very long gestation period, and they only ever have one calf at a time because the calves are 5 feet long and can weigh close to 200 pounds. So very big babies, only room for one in there. And they will only have a calf once every 3 years or so because there's a 2-year lactation period. Females become mature around the age of 6 to 8 years, and males are thought to be mature around the age of 9 years. So we do have some basic information about the reproductive biology of this species. And in trying to understand why they're not reproducing at the rate that they should so that this population can grow, they've been able to do research on the habitat of the belugas. Are there impacts on the habitat that might be interfering with their ability to survive? Are there nutritional concerns? Is there enough fish in the environment? Or even pollution? Is there pollution in the environment that's somehow impacting their ability to reproduce? And there's a lot of this research out there. One thing that's been understudied is the impact of behavioral influences. Certainly when animals are going to breed, there's behavior involved. And sometimes this behavior can be really complex, and it can have impacts on whether or not breeding takes place in the first place. And this is completely unknown for beluga whales. And it would be really handy if we had information about this, like how do males and females select their mates? How do individuals ensure reproductive success? What traits might be influenced by these processes? Are there things about the beluga whale that might be affected by reproduction? And are there external factors, things that humans do that could interfere with these behaviors and perhaps limit reproduction to explain why that population might not be growing at the rate that it should be? The problem here is that we can't observe them in the wild during their breeding season. Because if you remember, they breed in the late winter and early spring. And so this is an image of Alaska. So if you're familiar with the Aleutian Islands sticking out into the Pacific Ocean, this is all ice coverage. And so because of the sea ice and the fact that a lot of their interesting behavior occurs underwater, we don't have access to these animals the way that Kel might with her population of spotted dolphins down in the Bahamas, or other animals that are a lot easier to access. You just can't get to where beluga whales are during the breeding season, and you can't observe them in a way that wouldn't interfere with their behavior. And so what we know about beluga whale breeding behavior in the wild is based on educated guesses. We infer what their behavior might look like. So then how could we get this information? How do we get information about reproductive biology? Of course, you can learn a lot from post-mortem sampling after the animal has died and get a lot of information about their biology. I love these old-timey photos. You can almost like smell the coal smoke in this photo. But of course, we can gain an incredible amount of information by studying beluga whales in aquaria. So here we're doing an ultrasound on a female beluga whale, and we can monitor that same individual throughout her entire reproductive cycle to monitor them. There's just no good way to do this on a wild beluga whale. And I would argue you wouldn't want to do this on a wild beluga whale because it would require you having to catch them and handle them multiple times, where of course the preferable situation here is to train the animals to participate in the behaviors voluntarily that allow us to gather this kind of information. And then we can track them all the way through pregnancy and giving birth. And basically this is just an excuse to put a cute beluga on the screen. And we can track these animals longitudinally to learn a lot about them.
I think both Kel and I have questions, so go ahead, awesome. Kel. Or maybe not.
She's frozen.
Okay. Well, I'll ask my question. Since you were talking about inferred behaviors, do you think that it would be possible or beneficial to take what we know about, for example, bottlenose dolphins or spotted dolphins and extrapolate to belugas?
That's exactly what's been done. Yep. So we take information that we know about species that we have been able to study a little more closely, and we apply those concepts to belugas based on their anatomy, on their physiology, on the seasonality of their reproduction. So we can take clues and we can guess what their behavior might look like, but we can't really zero in on exactly what it might be.
Well, I think also there hasn't been a direct comparison between various behaviors that have been extensively studied in dolphins to beluga whales.
Right.
So I think that might be, that would be neat to do, so you could have more of a rubric to
yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And even amongst dolphins, of course, their behavior can be very different, even depending on where the same species might be living can impact their breeding behavior. So yeah, there's a lot of unanswered questions out there for sure.
And one other question that came in, Kel actually lost her connection, but she typed it in. She said, did you say how old? I don't remember if you did, but how old this little calf is?
Oh, this calf would just be a couple of days old.
Very cool.
Yeah, this was a calf born at Shed Aquarium. I took this picture and I had the pleasure to visit that aquarium, which is beautiful.
Nice. Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So if we're going to try to understand how these populations grow, this comes down to a question of population dynamics. How do populations grow or decline? And of course, a key question here is why some populations fail to reproduce at the rate that we would expect them to. And part of this comes down to, are there simply enough mature individuals in the population to support reproduction? And if there are, but maybe the females are either not getting pregnant in the first place, or the alternative is that they're getting pregnant, but for whatever reason, they can't successfully carry the calf to term or raise that calf. And those are two different management questions. And so we can study aquarium whales to determine how best to answer these questions in wild belugas. And we can validate research tools and methods and approaches by studying aquarium belugas and then apply them to the study of these wild populations to try to gain a better understanding. One of the things that I'm very interested in is monitoring reproductive hormones. And you might have heard of these before, like progesterone or estradiol or estrogen or testosterone. Of course, humans have all of these same hormones as well. Hormones are fascinating little chemicals. You can think of them as chemical messengers. They travel through your bloodstream and affect processes at the cellular level. And reproductive hormones are fascinating because they're steroid hormones. And what steroid hormones do, so think back to 5th grade biology and cells and membranes and all that business. Steroid hormones are actually able to travel through the cell membrane into the nuclear membrane, where they bind with receptors inside the nucleus to affect what genes get switched on or switched off in terms of what gets translated. So this is affecting gene expression directly. So they're really fascinating little chemicals, and because they're impacting the DNA and how DNA gets expressed, they can have lots of downstream impacts on the animal. And it regulates certainly the physiological aspects of reproduction, but also behavioral aspects, like testosterone might help mediate the aggressive behavior in these elephant seals, for example, fighting over access to females. Of course, pregnancy is supported by progesterone. Progesterone is really high during pregnancy, and there are also hormonal changes that occur that will help to trigger parturition and the birth of the calf. So these hormones are really important in regulating the physiology and the behavior of reproduction. So we can then use the hormones as indicators of these various physiological or behavioral events. Now, studying reproductive hormones in whales, go ahead, Kathleen, you have a question?
I figured that would be a good way to do the interruption.
Yeah.
I did actually I had a couple of questions. I'll ask one of them now is, are there adaptive reasons that we know of, or maybe guess at, why the calves are born gray as opposed to white? And then when do they become white versus gray?
Okay, so if you read kind of the classic books on beluga whales, they'll tell you that the white color of beluga whales is camouflage. And the idea is that you know, there's a lot of white in their environment in the form of ice and snow, and so their white coloration would allow them to hide from predators. However, their most prominent predator is a echolocating animal that is not likely to be fooled by a beluga whale blending with their background. That's the killer whale. And it's also interesting that the age classes that are most prone to predation are young animals. Those are the animals that are most likely to be eaten. And young belugas are dark gray. So if a young beluga is not going to hide against the ice with that dark gray color. So I think that there's still some unanswered questions about exactly why beluga whales are white. And if I remember later on, I'm going to give you my personal hypothesis because it links to some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about later.
Awesome. Then I'll wait to give you my thoughts on why as well.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm interested to hear.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Sure. So studying reproductive hormones in whales in aquariums is really easy because they can be trained to allow us to draw a blood sample. So here's a beluga trained to put their tail right in my lap, and then the veterinarian can come and draw the blood sample. But in the wild, of course, the whale's not going to come over and give you their tail. And so the way that you collect a sample from a wild whale is by firing a biopsy dart. So this is from research that's done up in Canada, where they're able to collect samples from the whales of their skin and blubber. And they can get hormones from the blubber of these wild belugas to figure out if the whale is pregnant or not, which is really, really great and really important for monitoring these populations. But my goal is to try to do this less invasively. And that's where this whole whale snot business comes in. So this image is, I took this picture of a humpback whale in a whale watch for a course that I lead at URI. And when a humpback whale comes up to the surface, the first thing that they're going to do is exhale very, very forcefully. And you get this big, tall plume of water vapor. And what this is primarily is when the humpback whale comes up to the surface, their blowhole is essentially a big bowl on top of their head because it's closed. And so water will pool on top of their blowhole. And so when they surface, they'll exhale to clear that water off the top of the blowhole. So all the water that you see kind of coming up here is not coming from their lungs. They'd be coughing or the whale equivalent of coughing if they had that much water in their lungs. But instead, it's that water that's sitting up on top, but also mixed in here is water vapor. Exactly like when we breathe, when we're outside in the cold, we can see the water vapor condensing, but that happens all the time. We're just able to see it better in the cold. And also contained in this is mucus that lines the upper respiratory tract of the whale because they're breathing so explosively. And they use so much more of their lung volume than we do with a given breath. They estimate that whales and dolphins are using about 80% of their lung volume every time they take a breath, compared to about 15 or 20% in a human. So every breath is a big, forceful breath, so they can exchange a lot of gas in a short amount of time and spend the least amount of time at the surface because their food is not at the surface, their food's underwater. So this big explosive exhale carries up that mucus that lines the respiratory tract, the upper respiratory tract, down inside the blowhole and in the passageways leading to the lungs. Now, the thing about this mucus is not just mucus, but it's a true biological matrix that has all kinds of stuff in it. And one of the things that you can find within this sample are hormones, especially steroid hormones, like reproductive hormones. So what I wanted to know was, and this was, I didn't come up with this idea. This research was out there and they had studied hormones in the exhales of humpback whales and some other species. But what wasn't known and what we needed the study of aquarium whales to do was to understand if we could assess the reproductive status of an unknown beluga using reproductive hormone measurements in blow. So if we catch an exhale sample, say from this whale that's surfacing, you can see the exhale here. Is there going to be enough information in here for us to learn something about this whale? And this is a beluga calf. I took this picture up in the Arctic, doing some field work up there. But the idea here is if we can collect the exhale, can we learn something about this whale that we wouldn't otherwise be able to know? And essentially what this comes down to is we measure the hormones and that gives us a number, right? We have a quantity that we can measure, but what we need to know is what those numbers mean. So if we can say, well, there's 322 picograms of progesterone in the sample, that's great. But without any context, that has zero meaning. We can't interpret that number. So what we needed were whales that we knew a lot about and we knew the reproductive condition of, so that when we measure these hormones in their blow samples and we know their reproductive condition, now we can start to understand what these numbers actually mean. And this type of research is only going to be able to be conducted on aquarium belugas. So this was a key step in developing this research approach. So I was very fortunate to have a lot of wonderful collaborators at zoos and aquariums throughout the US and Canada, where we had 21 beluga whales that we could learn all about by collecting their exhale samples. And this is how it's done. So this is one of my students, and she's holding a petri dish over the beluga whale's blowhole, and then the trainer taps the whale on the head, and that's the cue to exhale forcefully. So the whale will exhale onto this plate, and then afterwards, this is what the plate might look like. This is a particularly mucousy one. They're not all this snotty, but this is a pretty good one. So this plate is a petri dish that's covered with a nylon material. And so we can take this nylon material and mop up the sample off the petri dish, and we put it in a tube. And this tube has the back end of a syringe stopper. So, like on a syringe, the part that you draw out. If you pull that out of the syringe and cut it in half, you can stick it in the bottom of this tube here, and this forms a stopper. And then we'll put this tube in a centrifuge, which is going to spin this tube really, 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 really fast. And the idea is that the nylon is going to stay stuck on top of this syringe stopper, and just the centrifugal force of being spun around really fast is going to squeeze the fluid sample out of the nylon and lead us with that blow sample right down at the bottom of the tube. Just like now it's just like blood or urine or anything else that you might want to measure hormones in. Go ahead, Kathleen.
So the question is, do you have to be a certain distance from the blowhole with the petri dish to get a particularly snotty sample, or have you looked at the distances that the petri dish can be?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's part of what we're trying to figure out now. So during the development of this methodology, we needed to make sure we got good samples, so the petri dish was close. Ideally, in the wild, what will ultimately happen is that these samples would be collected by a drone flying over the animal. And so we're working to try to understand how close that drone would need to fly to the whale to get enough of a sample to do these types of analyses. Great question. So yeah, that's in development. Yep.
Very cool. I saw something on social media recently that they were using drones to fly over the larger baleen whales to collect samples. And,
yep.
and I think they used the entire drone as the collection device because it just looked coated.
Yep. Yeah, they put little skids on the hexacopters. They'll put collection material all across the bottom, and they're able to fly through. And on a big whale, I don't want to say it's easy because it's not easy, but it's easier than a beluga whale, which doesn't create that big, tall, plume that we're familiar with seeing.
Cool.
But they've done it with dolphins, so we know it can be done. So it's just a matter of the technology is going to get better, and we're going to get there.
Sounds good. Well, thank you.
Sure. So one of the hormones, of course, I'm most interested in is progesterone, which is going to be much higher during pregnancy. And ideally, we're able to use it to detect pregnant females. And this, of course, is critical for conservation efforts. And I'm going to hand wave over about 3 years of research in developing the methods to handle these samples, to isolate and measure the hormones. So let's just say that's where PhDs are made. and move on right to the fun data. So this is just showing how much progesterone is in blow samples from beluga whales that are not pregnant and beluga whales that are pregnant. We are, again, because I've worked with so many wonderful collaborators, we were very lucky to have some pregnant beluga whales that were sampled. And I drew this line on this graph here because you can see it very clearly separates all of the samples that we collected from non-pregnant belugas and the samples we collected from pregnant belugas. And so, you know, doing some math and some stats, we can figure out the probability of an animal being pregnant if you collect a blow sample that has a progesterone of this level. So it's not perfect, but it's kind of like a whale snot pregnancy test, which is kind of cool. Testosterone is another important hormone that I wanted to measure. It's associated primarily with male sexual characteristics and behavior. We know it should be higher in males than in females, and that mature males should have higher testosterone. So maybe we can use testosterone to indicate maturity, which would be really handy because we don't have a good way of assessing maturity of a free-swimming wild beluga. And we know it should be higher during the breeding season than outside of the breeding season. So if we were able to track levels over time in individuals, then we can monitor that reproductive seasonality and also maybe follow young males to see when they reach maturity, which is important information to have. And so this, again, some hand waving, but here we've got testosterone concentrations in blow samples over the course of the year. So on the x-axis down here is all the different months. And this is from a number of different males, again, working with my collaborators. And the line is showing kind of the average testosterone levels across the year. So you're seeing this testosterone being higher during beluga whale breeding season than outside of it. So having these now minimally invasive tools to monitor reproductive hormones opens up a lot of doors. But there are other ways that we could study population dynamics, especially by monitoring genetic material, DNA. If we had DNA, we can definitively tell if a whale is a male or a female. And this might sound silly, but it's actually very hard to tell the difference between the sexes just by looking at them. It would tell you information about how individuals relate to other whales in the same population or even across the entire Arctic. And it can also give us clues about social relationships. If we understand which whales are hanging out with which other whales and whether or not they're related, and start to peel apart that onion of understanding the social structure of beluga whales. So where do we get DNA? Cells, of course. Maybe you've looked at your epithelial cells under the microscope. If you've ever scraped your cheek, it's a pretty common exercise you'll do in school, in high school biology or something like that. These are beluga epithelial cells under a special light. So they're not normally purple, of course, that's the light. And the nuclei show up really bright here. This kind of yellowish looking spot here, that's where the DNA is gonna be. Well, normally you get the cells from a beluga whale in the wild by that biopsy sampling. And so, of course, we want to know, is there another way to access those cells? And you guessed it, more whale snot. So this is a similar image. So this is under the microscope looking at a whale snot sample. And you can see many epithelial cells there, which means that we can get whale DNA from their breath. Now this is really exciting because it's a much less invasive way to collect the sample, and we've been able to isolate DNA and do a whole slew of analyses using the DNA from the blow sample, which is really exciting and again opens up a lot of doors in terms of what we can do in studying these animals. So if we develop these new ways to study hormones and DNA, the idea is that we're building on what we learn in aquariums to help conserve wild populations. So my research focuses on the reproductive biology of the beluga. And I think that studying aquarium belugas is really important because they're very difficult to observe during their breeding season in the wild, as I pointed out. Tracking the same whale over its lifetime is pretty much impossible in the wild for belugas but we can absolutely do that in the aquarium and get information we'd never get otherwise. And then we can also link these studies to traditional knowledge of people that live in the Arctic and have been subsisting on beluga whales for both cultural and nutritional subsistence for thousands of years to help us better understand beluga populations throughout the Arctic. So I'm gonna tell you a story now. So now we've got our research tools, so how do we apply them? I did a longitudinal study, so a long-term study over the course of an entire year for the belugas at the Mystic Aquarium, where we had a little bit of a love triangle with 2 males and 1 female. And I had weekly physiological measures along with behavioral observations. And one of the things that really jumped out about studying these whales is that they have very frequent courtship display behaviors. And this panel is showing one of the most common ones. This is the male down here. And I'm going to switch to my laser pen so you can see this better. So this is the whale, the male, this is a female. And so the male approaches the female and takes on this S posture here. And this male is pressing the genital region closer towards the female. They're not attempting to copulate. This is completely a visual display. And the neat thing about this is because we knew about the physiology of the whale at the time that the behavior was occurring, we could start to decode the functions of these behaviors. And we find that these display behaviors are occurring almost exclusively during the female's breeding season. So this is what it looks like as it's happening. So you can see it's all very slow and deliberate. And so here's what the data looks like. So if we look at the various display behaviors that the males make, they're almost entirely occurring during the breeding season for the female, which was determined by measuring her hormones in her blow sample. Kathleen?
So when you described that male behavior or posture as an S posture, it reminded me of the S postures that we've documented in dolphins. Yeah. And often that behavior originally was identified as an aggressive posture, or one used only during fights or aggressive exchanges. But we also, in our research looking at the dolphin behavior underwater, identified juveniles using this behavior during play, or other individuals using it at other times. So do you see the S posture used by younger animals, kind of like practicing during play, or is it really something that they only use when they are older males and when the females are receptive, so to speak?
I know that, well, first, let me say that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kathleen, but this S is actually inverted compared to the behavior that's traditionally thought of as aggressive. So in dolphins, the head would be up, the genital region would be up, and the tail would be down. Is that correct?
It depends on the orientation of the animal in the water column. So for me, when I look at that animal, I would still characterize that head as the top of the S, even though the S is upside down.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is this animal is tucking their head towards their chest, where the aggressive posture is lifting the head up to kind of
see. I've seen it both ways.
Okay,
I've seen it where the head is tucked down.
Yep.
And I'm not sure if, at least in the stuff in the research that I've done, where they've said that it's a tuck up or down, because each time that I've seen it, the head's been down. And maybe that is during a play or
maybe
a less aggressive
different context. I'm sure they can discriminate whether or not head is up and down, and so they're probably receiving different information from the sender depending on the orientation of the S. That would be really cool to explore.
Do you ever see these S postures by these males with the male non-inverted, but the female inverted? Like, would he ever approach a female who's upside down?
Yeah, it's just this particular image. Right. They'll do this in all different orientations.
Okay.
Yeah, it does, but it's always underwater. It's never at the surface.
Okay.
And they're usually on one of the female's sides. So they're usually displaying towards the female side, which makes sense because that's where her eyes are.
Yeah.
And that's where she'd be able to see it best.
Right.
Where presumably, in order for breeding to actually occur, they need to be belly to belly. So it's kind of interesting to think through that. But you also asked about juveniles doing this, and there's actually been some really great research coming out of SeaWorld in San Antonio with Heather Hill and Malin Lilly and some of those folks who are doing really cool stuff looking at the development of these behaviors over different ages, because at Mystic we only have adults. And so
Okay.
it's, again, that shows the importance of collaboration where we can get information from different ages that we wouldn't be able to get. And so working together like that is so cool.
Very cool. Well, thanks.
Sure. So yeah, so we've got huge disparity in their behavior. And again, this was linked to the physiology of the female based on the hormones in her blow sample. And if we watch this interaction, so here's the male, the female's behind. You can see the male performing more display behavior. So he's got his mouth open and he's shaking his head around, and that's the melon that's wiggling up and down there. And if that's not, hey, pay attention to me, then I don't know what is. But what's really interesting is when the female reciprocates this behavior and also shakes her head back at the male. And I can't help but watch these animals interact like this and think of birds and think of, you know, a singing bird doing all the displays. I'm sure you've seen lots of cool documentaries where they're doing all different types of display behaviors to try to get the attention of the opposite sex. And this melon is really cool because they're the only species of whale dolphin that can change the shape of their melon at will. So that's an animal trained to do that on cue for us. And I was curious if they use the shape of their melon to help communicate with other belugas. Like, are these essentially beluga facial expressions? You know, they don't have a lot of musculature around their face like humans and other primates do. Basically, they can either open their mouth or not open their mouth. And so does having the ability to change the shape of their melon allow them to convey different signals that might not otherwise get conveyed? And it's pretty fascinating to look at all the different shapes that they'll make when they're communicating with each other. And they almost exclusively change the shape of their melon. So this is normal. Here, I'll get my laser pointer back. This is what a normal beluga head looks like when they're just kind of swimming around. And this is the same animal in all these pictures with all different orientations of their melon. And it seems like they make consistent shapes. And so part of this research now for me is to look at when these shapes are occurring relative to the physiology of these animals and also the other kind of behavioral context that these melon shapes might occur in, so that we can try to understand what these mean when they're communicating with each other. And they do seem to be more likely to perform certain melon shapes when they're engaged in certain behavioral contexts. Like there's that one where they wiggle their head and let the melon kind of flop around. That almost exclusively occurs during courtship behavior. So to kind of wrap this up here, the really interesting thing, and something I don't want to get missed here, you know, we're focusing in on these display behaviors, which are really cool. But what's most interesting to me is how the female responds to these display behaviors. And I can measure her behavior towards these displays. And I found that she will behave differently depending on who is performing the display. And so that seems to indicate that these displays are important in how these animals are able to select mates. And just like in birds, you know, think of a peacock spreading their tail and fanning their tail feathers to try to attract the female's attention. The female is then going to behave differently towards those different males depending on that display. So the idea is, if beluga whales are very choosy, then perhaps either there's not enough high quality males, or they're just being over choosy, or they're just having a hard time finding suitable mates in these small populations. That might help explain why some of these small populations are not reproducing at the rate we might expect. Kathleen?
We had a question about the melon pictures.
Yeah.
And so it was, what's the difference between melon flat and melon press?
Good question. Melon flat, the front of the melon is pulled in, but the rest of the melon stays rounded. In a melon press, the front of the melon is pulled in a little bit, but primarily what I think the muscle action is the muscles pulling down on the melon and squashing it. So when I'm talking to students about this, I engage a lot of students in this research. I tell them to imagine a water balloon. And that water balloon represents their melon. And so on a melon press, you can almost imagine someone pushing down on the top of the water balloon, and that water's got to go somewhere, so it kind of spreads out a little bit. Where a melon push, you might push down like this in the center of the balloon so that the water goes either direction. And these correspond to musculature that surrounds the melon on the head of these animals. And so they seem to make similar shapes across individuals because this musculature, the muscular anatomy is the same across individuals.
And is that true of the melon press versus the melon flat?
Yeah, so I think for the melon flat, it's only the muscles in front. There are some that are running obliquely that are pulling down. Where the melon press, it's the muscles that are running ventral to dorsal that are contracting.
And we noticed, or some folks noticed who are listening, and it may just be the photos that you've selected, but for melon flat, the mouth always seems closed. But for some of the others, the mouths are open.
This is a really great point. And this is one of the things I'm looking into as well. And I think because, primarily they either have an open mouth or a closed mouth. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that the melon shapes do is it helps to modulate that signal. So an open mouth with a lift might mean something different than an open mouth with a push, which might mean something different than a closed mouth with a push. So there's multiple ways that they might be modulating their communication here that I'm hoping to explore.
Very cool. Well, it's the same as, dolphins using behaviors and then assuming different postures.
Exactly.
With another individual, and it modifies the message completely.
Right.
So
right.
It's very cool.
Yep. So again, just to kind of hammer home this point, my goal here in doing this research is to develop hypotheses and to validate methods, research tools, and approaches by studying aquarium belugas that we know a lot about these animals, and we can monitor them and watch their behavior in ways that we'd never be able to watch the behavior of wild belugas, with the goal of applying those methods, those research tools, and those hypotheses to study wild belugas. So that we can answer questions that are really stymieing the conservation and management of these animals in the wild. So I see this as a really critical link for providing information that wild population managers need to do a good job and to help these animals continue to persist. So with that, I'm going to end on a photo by John Anderson here.
Very cool.
And ask if there's, I know we've been asking questions throughout, but if there's any more questions,
I do have a couple that came in.
Yeah.
One of the more recent ones is that, have you seen testosterone changes in your research that coincide with the males developing a larger melon during the maturing stage?
Really good question. And the short answer is no, because I haven't been able to study that many young animals, but certainly the changes in the melon shape during development is a thing that happens. And I'm working with a student right now who's an engineering student who's helping to develop ways for us to quantify melon shape from digital images. And so I'm hoping to be able to apply that methods in collaboration with that student to try to study some of that stuff.
Neat.
Because then we could link it to physiology and age and all kinds of cool stuff.
Definitely. And then if they're using any one of those melon melon postures, like the melon push, and they produce vocalizations with it, that could also be modulation. But do you also see bubble emissions with that, if these are all postures or shapes used underwater?
Sometimes, but very, very rarely. So sometimes they will produce a big bubble cloud, but I find that they most often do that, honestly, when they're trying to position themselves in the water column. It seems like to me. but we do see that sometimes during social interactions, yes.
Yeah, we see that with dolphins who get really excited, and sometimes it's almost like they're leaky because they just can't help themselves, and they're vocalizing and swimming really fast, and bubbles coming out all over the place.
I find it happens a lot with belugas where we would relate it as they were surprised by something.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
And then one question that came early on, but I didn't find a spot to put it. Maybe you might make a comment for people, for our listeners who might not be aware, is the taxonomic differences between dolphins and belugas.
Great question.
Comment on that?
Yeah, so taxonomically, a beluga is as closely related to a dolphin as a dog is to a cat. So they're in different families taxonomically. So just like Felidae and Canidae are two families within Carnivora, belugas are in the family Monodontidae, and the only other living member of the family Monodontidae is the narwhal, which is the beluga's closest living relative. And then dolphins are in the family Delphinidae. So they're just in a different family. So they're both odontocete cetaceans. So they're both echolocating cetaceans that have teeth. So they're both odontocetes, but they are in different families taxonomically.
Very cool.
Great question.
Cool. Yeah. So I think we've actually been peppering you with the questions throughout, which is pretty cool. So do you have anything else? It was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks. No, I had a lot of fun sharing, and I really appreciate everyone joining in. I hope you learned something fun. So thank you so much for having me, Kathleen.
And thank you. And I'm actually going to take the screen back, I think.
I can stop my sharing. Yep.
Okay. Yep. And I'll continue. And I'm going to show hopefully everybody can see the slides. I'm not going to pull them up, but it's just to say thank you to everyone. And our webinars, as you can see, are archived on the DCP website under the education tab. And the most recent ones, this is an older photograph, the most recent ones will be on the top. And Justin's webinar will be up later tonight or tomorrow morning. And you can also visit some other sites, other pages on our website for information. We have the Dolphin Pod, which is hosted by the DCP Justin Gregg and Laura Teasdale. The most recent one was up there in early September in honor of our 20th year anniversary. And we have our deep dive webinars and our dolphin lessons coming up. Our next webinar is on the 20th, which is a Meet the Adopted Dolphin Wild Dolphins. And then we have the shark dolphin interactions down under on the 22nd of October. And I
saw that one question.
I know I have to say that because did we get yours, Justin?
Yeah, no, I'm going to weigh in here. So,
okay, Justin can go first, and then I'll do mine.
Yeah. So obviously, what jumps out to me, in watching these animals behave, is the amount of visual displays that they perform. Whether it's, with their head and mouth or, the body postures. And there's a lot of visual displays that seem to be important to these animals. And so my personal hypothesis that I'd love to figure out how to test someday, but I don't know if it's ever feasible, is that these animals turn white when they reach sexual maturity. And actually, a lot of them don't reach that bright white color until a few years into sexual maturity. And so I think it might be related to making these visual displays more visible as an adult, because if you remember early on, I showed a picture of some belugas swimming in the Cook Inlet, and that water is like chocolate milk. It's not very clear water. It's not the Bahamas. It's not Roatan. It's murky, and I think that white color might serve to make those displays more detectable, more easily detectable by the receiver.
Yeah. Well, I would agree mostly with that, but I would think in talking to you, Justin, and to Heather and some of the other folks who study belugas, as well as talking to folks who study the Amazon River dolphin and our research on Atlantic spotted dolphins, there are color patterns that are different as an animal matures and ages. And It may be for camouflage. It may be an indication of maturity. So Atlantic spotted dolphins are born without any spots. They look just like bottlenose dolphins, but as they age, they get more and more spots, and those spots are counter shaded. So the fact that the water is murky and dark, maybe the calves being, and the younger animals being that dark color, means that they actually are camouflaged when they're near mom, you know, when they're in that position that is energetically feasible, whether it's echelon or infant, but they're blurred in. You can't really see them that well, which is the same with calves. And, you know, with the Amazon River dolphin, they get to a pink color when they're older. So, you know, there's a variety of different possibly reasons we're not really sure of, but I do think it's related to maturity. I think also what we've seen with the younger dolphins is older dolphins will know this is a younger animal, so they are learning how to use their signals, and so I can cut them some slack and I won't beat the pulp out of them because they don't really know what they're doing yet. And I've seen that in some cases. And then when you get an older individual, it's like, okay, you should know better, so you're going to get smacked a little. So and that's being very anthropomorphic, but I think that there's some evidence for that in terrestrial animals that have different color patterns when they're younger. And this is in a lot of birds too, you know, until they get their adult plumage. And
absolutely.
But you're right, it's very hard to study. It's very hard to go out and look at that, especially because younger animals are more protected by the group as a whole. Right. So very exciting. Well, thank you. And we got to thank you for that. Woohoo. Oh. So, You're welcome, Kaya. So if you guys, if anyone has questions about this presentation, feel free to send us an email. You have the various ways that folks can stay in touch with DCP through our website, through all of our social media. And of course, in order for us to keep doing these webinars for free, it's always helpful when our public supports us. And so there's a variety of different ways that DCP can receive support. And, you know, if you happen to be a student at URI and you want to join one of our programs, then stay in touch with Justin and you can come down with him to do our field courses there as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Justin. I really enjoyed your presentation today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.